In my message today, I'd like to speak a little to what is going on right now. And I won't do this every week. We hear enough about COVID-19 that I think sometimes we're all looking for a little distraction. So there will be jokes and stories in the future, as there are here most Sundays. But for this morning, I would like to share a few thoughts. And I'd like to begin with a short reading from the Bible. And this was the psalm that I read 19 years ago on the first Sunday after 9/11, a portion of Psalm 46. God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in times of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. Though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, God is in the midst of the city. It shall not be moved. God will help it when the morning dawns. I still remember sharing those words that day. I threw out whatever sermon I was working on and spoke to the fear that everyone was feeling that day. You know where you were on 9/11, and you will always know where you were on 9/11. The events of those days didn't just leave an imprint on us, they tattooed us, forever linking a day with an act, with a memory, with a feeling. It was such an unnerving time. And most of us hoped that maybe this would be the calamity that would define our generation. And then along came COVID-19. And for some of us, we were transported back in time to feel some of the things we may have felt after 9/11. And when the dust settles on all of this, and we come back together in our social circles and unpack all of this, no doubt we will all be able to remember the exact moment when our breath caught in our chest or in our throat, when our senses suddenly widened and we knew that something big was happening, something life-changing. I think for me, it was the moment they announced that due to a player testing positive for COVID-19, the NBA was suspending all games until further notice. No basketball. Oh well, I thought at least we had the Leafs, but only for another 24 hours. Watching all those fans leave the arena after it was announced that the game was canceled was something to see. And the song playing as they left was Rhythm of the Night. It felt like not only the rhythm of the night, but the rhythm of life was changing. For me, that was my moment, and I'm sure you have your moment as well. What was it for you? Maybe when Disney World announced it was closing. Disney World never closes. Or the Prime Minister's call to bring Canadians back home. Or Donald Trump's dire press conference. And in that moment, it kind of felt like 9/11 again. That tightness in our chest, the sense of urgency, the dawning of uncertainty, and again, just a feeling that life had changed. But of course, there is a big difference between these two generational moments. The difference between 9/11 and this latest crisis is that after 9/11, we were urged to carry on with our lives. Keep going out for dinner, go to the mall, go to church. Don't let the enemy win. And this time the message is kind of the same in don't let the enemy win, but the tactics in this war are exactly the opposite. Stay away from each other. Don't go to church. Don't go to the mall. Don't go out for dinner. Keep your distance. Two threats to public safety. In one, we were told to carry on as usual. In the other, we were told to change almost every habit and routine we have. And I think for many of us, that's where this hits the hardest. At the very time we need each other, we are being told to stay away from each other. At the very time we need that reassuring hug, we are told to keep our hands to ourselves. However much we sometimes think we don't need other people, we do. We are social creatures and we crave and need the physical presence of other people. I remember the Sunday after 9/11. The church was packed as people looked for connection and courage and comfort, a sense that we were binding together to combat a common threat. This time, the weapon against the latest threat is isolation. And that's what makes this difficult, because we still need that connection and that courage and that comfort. We just can't get it in the same places and the same ways as before. And yet, as the old saying goes, you tend to find what you're looking for. Don't miss the signs of hope that are out there. Hands may not be able to touch hands, but hearts can still reach out and touch hearts. And there are signs that this is happening as we commit to getting through this together, even if we do it from a safe distance. Every smile on a passing face, every offer to help, every cheery good morning, they may seem small, but they are the antidote to this sense of isolation. And I think we know that the greatest challenge is not to let the fear around this direct our lives. Psychologists tell us that there is something called emotional contagions, where human beings tend to mimic back what we see in other human beings, and then we live those emotions forward and we pass them on to others. So if we see someone panic buying in a store with a stressed out look, we will tend as human beings to mimic what we see, feel drawn to do the same, and that's how fear begins to spread. In the movie Contagion, a drama about a pandemic, the leader of the Center for Disease Control, played by Lawrence Fishburne, said this, and I love this line: "In order to become sick, you have to first come in contact with a sick person or something that they touched. In order to get scared, all you have to do is come in contact with a rumor or the television or the internet. If you're a person like me who thrives on information, you may be watching the news 24/7, getting all the updates. But I learned last week that I need to take vacations from it all. So I'm trying between the hours of 9 to 5 to stay away from news and social media, just to give myself a break. Go out for a walk instead, and it makes me feel better. And when I go out, I'm keeping that smile on my face, and I'm saying good morning, because people will mimic back the emotions that you give to them. Exhibit calm, and for the most part, people will be calm back to you. Exhibit patience, and patience is what will return to you. Exhibit love, and you will, even in a small way, be a walking, living antidote to the fear around you. I've also learned the value recently of the wonderful concept called perspective. Perspective is the ability to put things into a bigger picture. In the biblical book of Ecclesiastes, it says these words: "Remember, there is nothing new under the sun." And those are true words. There's nothing new about pandemics. They've circled this world again and again and again, and will continue to do so. If you are 65 years old, do you know how many pandemics you have lived through and survived? The answer is at least 8. What's new about this pandemic is the global response. It sparked a response from governments unprecedented in this or any other time. But what is interesting is if you look at other former pandemics, is once again the bigger threat is the fear and misinformation they can spread. And sadly, that can bring out the worst in people, as there will always be conspiracy theorists, crackpots, and simply bad people who will mine this fear for their own glory and gain. If you think this is just an unfortunate side effect of modern-day social media, think again. There's nothing new under the sun. Case in point, one of the worst pandemics in history occurred in 541 AD. It was called the Plague of Justinian. In an attempt to root out the cause of the problem, the Roman emperor, whose name was Justinian, asked the leading historian of his day, a guy named Procopius of Caesarea, to find the origin of the plague and report back. And he did just that. He traced it to bacteria found in rodents in northwest India. It had traveled to Europe on boats leaving from ports in Egypt. The mystery was solved. However, good old Procopius, despite knowing better, tried to use this pandemic for political gains. He didn't like the Emperor Justinian. He returned to Rome and announced that the plague was the work of God's punishment on the people, and Justinian was in fact the devil. Justinian was removed from office, But here's what is interesting, is that Justinian was actively working to reunite the Western and Eastern remnants of the Holy Roman Empire. If he had been successful, many historians believe the dark ages that followed may have been avoided. I think that's great perspective, reminding us to be careful what and who we're listening to, especially if people are trying to invoke fear for their own personal gain or for political reasons, or even worse, to place blame on a particular race or culture of people. I've already seen posts on Facebook of people going into their Bibles trying to find proof that this is the wrath of God delivered on all of us. My advice, delete those posts. Using the Bible to find proof of this plague is like using a manual from a Model T to fix your Prius. It is, in a word, idiocy. Instead, if you're looking for a religious perspective on this, let me share the words of Rabbi Harold Kushner, who after the death of his son wrote the book When Bad Times Happen to Good People. This is what he said about his faith. I believe in God, but I do not believe the same things about God that I did years ago when I was growing up. I recognize God's limitations. God is limited in what God can do by laws of nature, the evolution of human nature, and human moral freedom. I no longer hold God responsible for illnesses, accidents, natural disasters, because I realize that I gain little and lose so much when I blame God for those things. I can worship a God who hates suffering but cannot eliminate it more easily than I can worship a God who chooses to make people suffer and die for whatever exalted reason. I now believe that God does not cause our misfortunes. Some are caused by bad luck, some are caused by bad people, and some are simply the inevitable consequence of our being human and living in a world of inflexible natural laws. The painful things that happen to us are not punishment for our misbehavior, nor are they in any way part of some grand design on God's part. Because the tragedy is not God's will, we need not feel hurt or betrayed by God when tragedy strikes. Instead, we can turn to God for help in overcoming it, precisely because we can tell ourselves that God is as outraged by it as we are. And finally, what I really want to say this morning, and what perspective and history has taught us, is I think we need to remember and believe in the ability of human beings to deal with, to adapt to their circumstances, and to be resilient when faced with threats. It's amazing. It can't be underestimated. We are a bounce-back species. A DJ on the radio a couple of days ago had great perspective. He said he was watching the stock markets and was worrying about his investments, as many of us are. And then he looked over and saw a picture of it on the mantle of his grandfather. He said this, "My grandfather was born in the First World War, survived the Spanish flu, lived through the Depression, served in the Second World War, and never did I see that man without a smile on his face. We persevere. We always have." And that reminds me of my friend Frank. Frank was a farmer and a member of my first church in Beaton. If anyone is watching today from Beaton, you know exactly who I'm talking about. Like that man's grandfather, Frank also lived through some world crises. He also served his country. He also negotiated the Depression. But he had another life-changing event to get through. He survived a very big cancer scare when he was a young father with 4 children. And like that DJ's grandfather, Frank was always happy, always grateful, and always joyful. If leprechauns do exist, I think Frank would be the living embodiment of one. And Frank credited his ability to get through life to one philosophy that he carried with him through every event that came his way. 4 simple words: "This too shall pass." Frank lived by that. Even in my 7 years there, I heard Frank use these words whenever a speed bump would come along in the life of the church. Everyone would panic. Frank would gently open his hands, smile, and in a soft voice would say, "This too shall pass." And everyone breathed, and everyone calmed down and silently nodded, because Frank not only said those words, He lived them. He was the embodiment of them. Do you know where that expression comes from? It comes from an old Persian fable in which a king asked his royal jeweler to design a ring that would give him magical powers to be wise and faithful and courageous with his people. A few days later, the jeweler presented the king with such a ring. The king looked at it and studied it. It didn't look like it had magical powers. It didn't look special. How could this ring make him wise and courageous? Jeweler said it's simple. Every time something happens that tests you, take the ring off and look inside. And inside the ring were written the words, "This too shall pass." Friends, heed the call of our ancestors through the generations who've lived through life's hardest times, for they speak with a collective wisdom, and they speak with one strong and courageous voice, reminding us that we can and we will persevere through hard times. In the psalm that I read, the author is reflecting on the challenging times of his day, and he begins with that incredible expression of his faith. God is our strength and our refuge, a very present help in troubled times. And then he goes on to write, though the city may be in peril, God is in the midst of the city and will not be moved. In other words, in troubling times, he centers himself in his faith. And those are words to cling to. As people of faith, we believe that nothing separates us from God's presence. Though all may shake and crumble around us, God is in our midst and will not be moved. That is our hope, friends, that we live in the presence of God, which is a presence of love and a source of peace. And nothing can separate us from that love. Not big planes crashing into buildings or tiny viruses crawling into crevices. When you feel anxious, lean into that hope. When you feel worried, pause in that peace. When you feel you may crumble and shake, remember the one who is always in our midst. And remember that we have, and we will get through this. The hymn, "Be Still My Soul," ends with two hopeful lines. And let me end with those lines too. Be still my soul, when change and tears are past. All safe and blessed, we shall meet at last. Amen.